You've already done a chat with everything.
Yeah. Fantastic. I believe the recording has just started. We are still a few minutes away. Fantastic. G'day, guys. I can see people are starting to roll in. We will start a few minutes past the hour, so don't stress. I'm just filling in some space just now as people are rolling in. I do want to say good morning and it's good afternoon now, isn't it? And thank you so much for joining this second session we have for Mental Health Month. Now, I know people are still coming in and I expect people to continue to do so for the next few minutes. So before we start, I just want to give a few pieces of information. I do want to say that this session is available as via YouTube as a live stream at the moment, and the recording would also be available on YouTube and linked on our website at the conclusion of today's session. That's important as well in case that this meeting room does get too full, in which case individuals can be directed to the YouTube link. The link is there in chat for you in case you want to forward that to anybody just now as well. While we're starting as well, I see I really enjoy starting these sessions with a quick get to know you question. So I want to get an understanding as to where people are. Sorry, you can't. Sorry, I've just got one person on chat saying that they couldn't hear me. Fantastic. I believe, yep, fantastic. That's good. If there is any tech issues on your end, I would suggest having a chat to somebody on your team. But as we start, I really want to ask a quick question. If you are sitting in front of your computers just now, I would love to know whether you currently are predominantly working from the home or if you're working predominantly from the office or somewhere else. And I want to just quickly ask as well, how many people have you personally interacted with within your organization in your average week? So feel free to just put your responses in the chat here. Oh, lots of people predominantly working from the office. That's excellent. 50-50 hybrid. So just quickly, I do ask if you have a question, feel free to put it on the Q&A section. I've got a member of my team monitoring those questions and we'll help respond to them. Oh, fantastic. 30-40 people, Missy. Yep, about 15 people a day. Excellent. Around that 20-30 mark, I've seen a lot of. Again, we'll just give another few more minutes for people to arrive. But before we do start, do let me introduce myself very quickly. My name's Edmund Tan, and I am the program lead of WayAhead Workplaces. Just a little bit of context, WayAhead is a non-for-profit organization that does mental health promotions and advocacy, of which WayAhead Workplaces is one arm of. We are currently running this Workplace Wellbeing initiative for Mental Health Month, and we have been supported in this by Safe Work New South Wales. And of course, we have Relationships Australia New South Wales supporting us as well today. I should just quickly note as well, the presentation will make use of the mentee platform today. So it might be helpful for some people to have your mobile phones nearby. Otherwise, if you do put any questions on Zoom, Elisabeth and I will monitor those questions as much as we are able. Fantastic. We have a member of team having a look at that question just now. Thank you. Excellent. So let me start on today's session very quickly. Before we start, in the spirit of reconciliation, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. With the referendum coming up this weekend, I can't help but implore everybody to give some time to seriously consider how you might be voting this weekend and how the outcome of this referendum may shape the soul and future of our fair lands. I want to welcome you to week 2 on this series around how we all have a role to play when it comes to workplace mental health and well-being. Last week, we had Dr. Natalie Flatt share with us about how there are different cohorts that each play a different role, outlining in a general sense how each of these roles can support our well-being at work. This week, we have Elisabeth Shaw, CEO of Relationships Australia here in New South Wales. Elisabeth is also a clinical and counselling psychologist, as well as having taught in several universities in topics including clinical practice, management, and professional ethics. She's exceptionally qualified to talk about the topic chosen today, and I'm really excited to have her share her insight with us in this area. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, and do let me pass you the floor.
Thank you. And welcome to everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and thank WayAhead for its leadership in putting together this seminar series. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on Wallamatical land today in Macquarie Park in New South Wales, and just to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of this seminar today. We are in a very complicated time leading up to the referendum, which is causing a lot of community disturbance. And in addition, we've all been hearing the news of what's happening in the Ukraine and in Israel, just to name 2 issues, and there are many others on at the moment. And I think, it's very important going into a webinar, and here you are in your work days, and it's very much what I want to talk to you about today, which is, how do we do this thing called work when there's a lot on our minds, and how does that play out at work? What permission do we have to even digest some of the stuff that's in our heads? How do we press on with a productive work day when, if you have family in Israel, or you have Aboriginal colleagues or family members, how do you do this, let alone so many other issues in family life, like having young children or having a sick parent or whatever it might be. There's a lot of calls on us and a lot of demands to also stay upright and keep going. So just want to acknowledge that, so that we sit with that very enactment of personal stress as we go through this topic today. As Edmund mentioned, I'll use mentee so that we can have a sense of inclusion, and because we've only got really a short time together, so I thought rather than do breakouts, maybe there's another way to keep a conversation going outside of chats. So if you do have your phone to hand, it's, for those of you who haven't used mentee, it's an extremely simple process, and I'll show you about that when we get there. But please feel free to use the chat as well. So we're looking at the topic today is very focused on workplaces and relationships, and I want to explore this through a number of angles and to toss up some ideas. Obviously, we can't run everything to ground, but I want to really look at this topic with you in a number of different ways that hopefully will lead you to talk with others in your lives about it or do some quiet reflection as well. Before we get into the topic, just a very brief infomercial on Relationships Australia. So many of you might have heard of us, might have used our services. We've been around 75 years. There's one of us in every state and territory, and we're very much known for our as our title, our relationship-focused work. We used to be called Marriage Guidance. So fortunately, we dropped that name in the mid-1990s, and we are really here across the lifespan for all aspects of family life. But we do a lot of work for people who are preparing for committed relationships, working issues through, or in some circumstances moving effectively towards separation. We also do a lot of work in the family law space surrounding that. So some of children's contact services and negotiating property agreements and parenting plans. But outside of that, in many of our programs, we're obviously tackling some of the worst aspects working on domestic violence services, but also trauma backgrounds around stolen generations, forgotten Australians, people who experienced forced adoption. So a lot of work around some of the big struggles of life, as well as doing some parenting education and helping people thrive in their relationships. So there's lots of things that we do. If you're interested in that, you might want to have a look at that. So today's focus, these are the kind of things that I'm hoping to cover, which is not just thinking about workplaces in the most superficial sense, which is just somewhere you go to earn your money, but really just looking at the meaning of them, what they provoke in us, how we move in and out of them effectively, and how we actually can have an effective spot in our working lives without getting overrun by institutional pressures or bureaucracies or dominant personalities. Looking a bit at the problem of other people, we always find other people difficult. They probably find us difficult. We can all be difficult, but often we give far too much time as to what other people are up to and try and plan our actions accordingly. So I just want to look at when other people are in whatever way disturbing us, what we might reasonably do instead. And what is it that keeps us safe and steady as we move in and out of a whole array of relationships? There's an interesting question Edmund just asked about how many people we run into each day. So everybody really talked about being around people, whether it's a smaller number or a larger number. We have to navigate people at all times. And it's not just a matter of doing 6 Zoom calls a day. It could be 6 very difficult calls. It could be making people redundant. It could be handling complaints. So conversations are provocative. They're not best described just by the head count of them, but what they involved. And also looking at this thing called life balance, because we often hear about having work and life balance out of whack. And we can feel very judged around that, can be accused that you're giving too much time to one thing or another. But I thought we just might freshen up. Well, what can we reasonably even think about that at this time? So hopefully we'll cover something on all of these things. It's a bit of an ambitious agenda, but we'll give it a red hot go. This is perhaps a useful quote, and of course, because I'm looking at some of you, I can't see the quote. But it's one that amused me when I read it and come back to it every so often, that there's never enough time to make the changes you need to make, but plenty of time to keep making the same mistakes. And we are creatures of habit. And this is partly, it's not because we're foolish, it's, or maybe sometimes it's because we're foolish, but mostly it's because we are creatures of habit and we settle into grooves. And even if we don't particularly like what's happening, we don't stop and even say, does it have to be like this? Or actually, I could take some steps for this to be different. So we can't achieve all of that planning in this one short hour. But I think to consider, perhaps as we talk together today, what are the things that you've settled into that you're not entirely happy with? And is it because you just haven't got around to thinking about it? Is it something in your heart of hearts really should be changing if you had the time and wherewithal to give it more consideration? And let's see if that's true, whether we could provide a bit of impetus improve how things are for you. So looking at the role of workplaces in our lives, they are a very large part of our day, of course, and they are the way that we meet our survival needs. So we all know that much. But I think there's just so much more that there is to consider because, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, but I think it's not just the hours we put in, it's the hours that we have our work in our heads too. So sometimes you might, if you're lucky, do an 8-hour day, or not lucky, but, some people do a lot more. But you might spend another 6 or 7 hours ruminating, worrying, planning, jotting down notes to yourself in case you forget, feeling anxious, deciding how you're going to handle a difficult person. So there's not many jobs where you can really down tools and there's nothing more to think about. Or certainly you can't do that all of the time. So the role that workplaces play can be very large in terms of the hours. They also really reflect something about our identity because so often we're introducing ourselves to people according to our role. After your name, it's often someone will say, "And what do you do?" And so that role, which starts to set a narrative about our place in society, how we exist in the world, whether we lead a purposeful existence, there's so much in all of this, which is why when people are retired, unless they've been looking forward to it and they're excited to claim the title retired, a lot of people feel very written off and purposeless and a bit at sea without that identity, because it's not just about what you say, it's about your identity and whether you stack up in relation to others. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe all of that, but I do think that work is very close to our hearts. There is something about, if you've ever been through the awful experience of being made redundant or having to enact a redundancy, that whole message, which is, I thought I counted and now I don't, which is, of course, not how you have to take it, and it's not really what it's about. But in your head, where you get sort of a bit panicked about it, it can feel like it's a message to you about you. And that's because who we are gets very caught up in our work role. When you're more dispassionate, you can say, "Oh, no, of course, I'm quite separate to my work. My work is not a full representation of who I am." But at certain points, whether you got a promotion, whether you're the boss's favourite, whether you're in that redundancy group or not, suddenly you can feel like you're on the line in some way. So this is much more than just where we turn up. It's also, it assumes an importance that we may not even want it to have. But there are also times in our lives where it's extremely pleasurable to us. So the time when you're building a career and you're in your first job, or you're on the exciting upward climb, or you're working on projects that really are fun, or you've moved into a team and you just find that sweet spot where you thoroughly enjoy everybody. It could well be that drinks on a Friday night are great fun. This is a really terrific crowd. So it's also saying that work can be so much more than we really take into account. And I think that's important in terms of that question of work-life planning, which I'll come back to. So first of all, though, I'd like to do our first mentee quiz. So what you can do is with your phone, you can either go up to the QR code, or what you can do is just Google mentee.com and enter this code that's on your screen right now. We're going to do a few of these. So once you've already logged in, you won't have to log in again. So Edmund and I were testing this out before. So he's written the first response, which is busy. So once you log in, just when you think of your work and your workplace, what are some words, some individual words that come to mind? And feel free to just put the first ones that come up. You might be particularly unhappy at the moment, or you might actually be having a really good time. You might be very stressed. You might be excited. So just as you do that, we'll see the words come up here. Okay, so just every so often when it stops, and no doubt you're doing this too, there's certainly a lot of peppering of positive words: satisfying, fun, happy, supportive, teamwork. Welcoming, exciting, friends. So there's interesting. So there's lots of things there that say that work is absolutely meeting people's needs and can be nourishing and a worthwhile place to engage. And there's also a lot of words there that are the ones that we often talk up more, and with good reason, no criticism, which is about, that it's also can be tiring and complex, and there's difficult people to manage, and it's challenging, which can actually be really positive, as well as sometimes negative. It can be, just complex. I mean, that can also be intellectually very engaging. So there's some uncertainty there. There's some chaos. Some people with mixed feelings, feeling undervalued, unsatisfied. So you can see that it is very mixed. It's interesting. I think what I'd just like you to think about as you look at that is that probably wherever you've put yourself right now, just as straw voters today, maybe you'd look around and say, actually, last week I would have said one of those other words. And in fact, by next year, this will be very different, and I'll put different sorts of words, because work is like any other set of relationships and processes. It can go up and down. There's a point sometimes when it's a bit more consistent, where we say, actually, I'm ready to change the workplace because I can read it well and I kind of can reasonably guess what's ahead. But it also can be all of these things. It can be a tough week, and the next week can be a better week. What we often don't do is talk about how much it matters to us and how much we're enjoying it. We do tend to talk about the negative far more, which is understandable because we want to debrief it. But for those of you with children, like with me, I remember even when my children were smaller, they'd say, if you don't like it, why do you go there? These very sensible questions that children can ask. And I did realise that perhaps I was conveying just not very much, but just comments about, it was a difficult day, or it was a busy day, or it was whatever it was. And I wasn't necessarily stopping and saying, I actually really enjoy my job and I really enjoy my work, and it's a job I really want to stay in. I don't think we go home and say that. We say something, and often the call out is a negative call out for the day. I mean, occasionally we might tell a funny story, but sometimes it is worth stopping and really thinking about, well, if all my first words are negative, why am I doing it, and what else is in the picture, and how do I tell the story of myself to myself? Like, how do I justify going there if I have negative thoughts, but how do I narrate this with others? And because sometimes how you narrate it to others means they'll relate back to that. So if you say, it's really tough, why don't you leave? Why don't you just leave? Other people have very simple solutions, and that can make you feel a bit defensive. But I think this question about our relationship with work, what it delivers for us and where it misses the mark, is a really good one to consider. The thing that I'd like us to look at is, and the thing that we also don't talk about much, is that work is actually a major source of socialising and connection. And that because it meets so many of our needs, but we're not supposed to talk that up too much because it might make us look too wedded to it or work obsessed. And we have this narrative that work is something you're supposed to get away from. You're meant to minimise it. You're meant to do something else, which is live your life outside of work. And you're meant to want to get away from work as quickly as possible into this really lovely thing called retirement that often people don't experience as particularly lovely at all for a whole range of reasons. And I think sometimes it's really good to say really deliberately what other needs is work meeting. and that's actually okay. It's okay to claim that, and for you to then think about it. So, for example, if you did say, actually, my work satisfies all of my sort of productivity sort of goals, but also it is my social life as well. Sometimes just the logic of putting too many eggs in one basket, if anything was to happen, that could be obviously a bit risky. But there are times in your life where socialising, it is really important. So, for example, if you live in the military, if you work in the military, then your family often will travel with you and will live with other family members, and you are often socialising with other families that are based somewhere because you've all moved to be at this base. Or it may be that you've moved interstate to take a job. So temporarily, if your work colleagues say to come to drinks, that's the only offer you've got. And so maybe you've just returned back to work after having a baby, and 3 other people on the team have just had a baby, and you become really close and connected about sharing that experience. These wonderful moments can be incredibly heartening and a great relief and a great pleasure. And even if you go through a tough time as a team, it can be very bonding. I think we've worried about inappropriate work boundaries so much, not only in terms of us having a skewed view, but also if you get too close to people at work, it could be inappropriate or unboundaried, or, you know, a lot of people actually meet their life partner at work, but mostly we hear the problems of that, and we all know why. But I think to say, well, this enormous thing that I do actually feeds me in a lot of ways. It tests me, it challenges me, it excites me, it gives me purpose. I really like my colleagues. And there's something about that that's far more mixed in a positive way than to say we've got work and then we've got life, as if these things are quite different. But workplace dynamics can also be really problem saturated. And because workplaces are hierarchical, they also can create similar circumstances to sometimes the way we've grown up. You know, so you can feel very caught up in what your boss thinks of you, and you realise, you know, that you were always waiting for approval from your parents, or you suddenly feel that you've recreated the schoolyard and you're caught in the same dynamics, or you feel that other people are the favourite sibling and you're missing out again. So, of course, we're all grown-ups and we don't want to think like that, because that sounds really infantile and all of us are far too big for that. But I think if you ever are anticipating a performance review, for example, and I've seen lots of people just get really nervous about that moment of judgment, which of course we're trained into from primary school. When you get your first report, someone is going to pass judgment on you. And these moments, which are often baked into childhood, they do stir quite a lot of feelings for us. And even moving into a meeting, it's amazing how perfectly reasonable people can get a bit unhinged in a group setting. I don't know if you've noticed that, where people just get more strident in what they say, or more argumentative, or someone who's perfectly confident in their views seems to go really quiet in a meeting. And often that is because there's even something about the nature of groups and how we come together that can stir the pot with past roadmaps we've had. It also could be that you're having, you know, a tough time at life, and sometimes just having to deal with other people also makes you feel like you just don't want to manage things for a little while in the same old way. You also find that workplaces are full of gossip, are full of in groups and out groups. We tend to default into silos, and we do silos because we like our group, even though we always talk about silos being a negative thing, and we've got to get away from silo sort of behaviour. In fact, some of it makes perfect sense, and it's a good way to have small groups within big groups connect and do productive work together. So there is something about, who do I belong to? What tables and seats do I get to be at? That are all part of the mix. But I think it's important to just stop and say sometimes that can be surprisingly provocative. And sometimes we can think, oh, I'm taking work too seriously, or people will say to us, oh, you just need another job. Sometimes it's worth saying, is there something about the nature of systems that stirs us up a bit, makes us perhaps more anxious than we would, like to be? And sometimes if you know that, some of those dynamics have followed you from other workplaces or other life situations, it's worth taking some time to disentangle them so that you can thrive at work more. The other thing just to note is just to lean into what we want in workplaces. So I just put a couple of quotes up here just for the sake of the argument. So one is about the nature of work, and that some of the prized skills now are sort of psychosocial demands, really, some of the interpersonal interactions and relationship skills. And in fact, I increasingly for myself recruit people according to their emotional intelligence and relationship skills, because not only because of the industry I'm in, but also most technical skills can be learnt. If someone's capable of learning, the bigger question is, are they going to be a good person to be around, a functional team member, a mature kind of grown-up? A lot of those skills are the things that we're looking for. And in workplaces, we're looking for this list at the bottom of the slide: collaboration, courage, problem solving, contributions to morale, being a good listener, productive and constructive. So when you look at these things, they're really talking about the people skills. These are the things that really make a workplace a success. And if you just think for a moment of the most difficult people you've ever worked with, they're usually doing the opposite of some of these things. They're getting in your way, they're being snarky, they're gossiping, they're backstabbing. These are the things that we hear about. They're not looking after your interests. They might be ambitious, but in a negative way. I think the other thing to call out is when we're not at our best, and we all have days like that, you turn up and think, oh, I'd rather have my head under the covers. But if these are the skills that are required, they're very heavy on you pulling something else out of yourself to say, okay, well, I actually feel like not speaking to anybody today. I'd like the world to disappear. But I've got a meeting and I really should look like a good collaborator, and I should be chatting and sounding enthusiastic, and I should be, influencing and rallying the troops, and all of these things that we need to do that are about delivering ourselves into relationships with others, calling on them to work with us and for us to paint a scene that we're good people to be around too. That's a heavy demand on us, to look at how do we do that when we're not feeling at our best. But the reality is that everywhere we go, there's somebody else we have to contend with. So I think this is a big consideration about the role of relationships and us in relationships in all the settings in which we turn up. And to remember that even to get to the office, for those of you that got to the office, we've had another whole set of relationships to contend with, whether it's a shared house, a intimate partner, managing kids. You might have caring responsibilities for elderly parents. It might be you had to run an errand for your neighbour before you left home. So you've had another whole set of relationships before you switch those off and start the next group. It's also important to note that organisations are in fact full of anxiety for a whole lot of reasons. And this is because, as I've said, we actually all have different needs. You'll have colleagues that are really introvert and might want to sit with their headphones on in open plan because they want to shut the world out. And there's other people that just thrive on interaction and demand a lot from you. People bring different experiences to the table. I work with people who can be very insecure about authority and what the hell they're up to. And there can be others who don't care less, speak up very directly, feel very confident. So I think there's a lot about that which does play out. And fundamentally, we do need our work to survive. We hope that we'll leave our workplace, not our workplace leaves us. So there's a threat in that. Always, do they want me? Are they going to keep me? Which also plays out. The group norms are very powerful. If you've ever worked in a place where corruption is at play, or you're told something like, this is the way things are around here, any statement like that is something to be a bit worried about. I remember joining an organisation where I raised a question in one of my first meetings, and someone said to me, we resolved that issue a few years ago and we agreed never to mention it again. And I thought, oh, that's a very interesting, that's a very big statement, isn't it? Because and that happened a few times. The topics we don't talk about are, and it's in your interest not to raise them. So there was, I had to wait out quite some time before those conversations became permissible again. But often those messages are very powerful about, well, my wings have just been clipped. How do I want to think about that? What does that mean for my work experience? Do I want to take that person on? Do I want to sort of shut up shop and creep away? What do I want to go and talk to others? And is that appropriate, or is that gossiping? So I think the group norms and what is said as well as what is done is a very good way to read the culture, but can be remarkably sort of a negative as much as it can be a positive. I think too that that loss is a part of an organisation, that you can have a sweet spot where your team is great, and that might last 6 weeks, 2 years. One person breaks ranks and suddenly other people think, oh, maybe it's time for me to go too. And the team is not quite the same. It's a different version of itself. For those of us that report to a board, you can have a sweet spot where the board and executive are working well together. And you can also have times when that's a very tricky combination. So I think the loss and how the ground we stand on, we can't control a lot of it. And again, how do we react when life is not in our control? Some of us handle that better than others. And in an organisation that's going through a lot of change, if people have an intolerance of change, that can be very difficult. So I think how we manage control and what sort of stability we're looking for. And there's a really big question for us to ask, which is, where is it that I can thrive? Or alternatively, where is it that I can do my best work? How can I be my fullest self? And organisations are entirely imperfect beasts, and we really choose which imperfection suits us at any one time. And some of the imperfections you can get quite fond of, and they're quite endearing. Like I work in the not-for-profit space, and I've always known not-for-profits can be entirely quirky, and most of it I feel very benevolent about and quite fond of our quirkiness because it works for us. And sometimes, we're just kidding ourselves, and that's just really poor form. So I think there's things to consider in all of that, but we've got to remember that we've got choices around the context in which we work, and we have a duty to ourselves to be in the best possible spot that we can engineer for ourselves. So we'll talk about that a bit more. So a final thing, just while I'm sort of naming some of the most contentious things, is that some organisations can also be full of fear at certain times. So for example, during COVID, I watched our waiting lists really climb. And at one stage, we had 1,100 people on our waiting list for counselling, which is actually an impossible situation. We're never going to be able to satisfy that demand. So when you actually see things like that happening, a lot of people change the course of their organisation and start to have fear-based practices. So you'll see some organisations like hospitals, there's debates about, are people being discharged too early? Sometimes that's because there's the fear if they stay in, they'll catch something else. Sometimes it actually can be because an organisation's not coping and their people are blocked at the door. People are triaged and sent away. It's almost as if the organisation doesn't want you there. I think fear-based practices, I'm sure for some of our colleagues, such as at PwC or where there's been really big issues in the media, people get afraid to lift the phone in case it's somebody else about to give them a serve. So again, what comes in from the outside and how we manage ourselves, how we move forward with trust in our bosses, trust in our colleagues. Am I safe in this place, psychologically safe? Can I be my best self at work? Sometimes people feel that they can't open up or share what's really going on. And this, in some ways, there were benefits around COVID, wasn't there, where even on Zoom, you watch someone's cat walk past and you suddenly just knew more about them. You could have a conversation about their cat, or they could say something that's going on in their home environment. And we felt that there was a greater sort of softness in understanding what was going on because we all had permission to drop our guard a bit. I think that actually built quite a lot of trust because we could talk about our fears and our uncertainties. But most of the time, we squash fear down or we squash anxiety down and we try and move forward as if we're trusting, but stopping sometimes to look at safety, collective management of safety with the team that we're in is really worthwhile. And if we don't do this, if we don't sort of talk about these issues as normal and actually just really often interesting to come to grips with, then other things can happen, which we'll come back to. So in terms of what can you reasonably do? So I've raised that, work can be amazingly provocative. And so what can we reasonably do in these situations? And we're going to talk about the problem of other people in a moment. But let's just look a little bit more at ourselves and how we manage this. So first of all, there is something about every so often stopping, and maybe you're doing that now, and saying, well, amongst this stuff that happens, all the stuff in my head, my to-do list, the schedule of meetings I've got to do this afternoon, who am I right now and how am I travelling in my working life? Am I on balance having a reasonably good time? Am I in the right place for me at the moment? Is this job meeting my needs? Do I feel mostly on a good day fairly steady about my performance, my contribution, who's around me? Sometimes just doing a bit of a stock takers, checking in with ourselves. And sometimes it's good to do this when you do hear from others, like I mentioned before with my kids saying, why do you do that if that's the issue? Just to realise maybe I'm over reflecting or ruminating or talking out the negatives. It's also a chance to say, maybe there's more to this. So I think looking at what is it that actually drives you? What is it that makes work important to you? Are you doing it in a way that that is satisfying to you? Is the context enabling you to work at your best? So let's just think about this a bit more. So for you, just going to mentee again, and if you think about right now, when you're at your most steady, and you might not feel steady at the moment, but what keeps you steady and emotionally on track? What are the sorts of things in your life that that allow you to be at your best when you are at your best? Mm-hmm. So this is a terrific list. And for those of you who perhaps don't always feel as steady as you'd like to, or as emotionally on track as you'd like to, what a terrific list that you could draw from. So the biggest, for those of you that don't know mentee, the biggest words are words that have had repetitive votes. So some people might have used similar words, but if it's a different word, then it'll come out in another way. So what we're seeing here is that exercise and family and getting support and friends and routine and good sleep, all of those things are really important in staying steady. And of course, they're in that space, that very definite space of self-care and social connection. So I think we know that is really critical for us. And it's not just about having work-life balance. It is also about looking after this vessel that we're in, and looking after sort of the bigger picture of what drives us. So there's lots of other things here that you'll see. Having good relationships, partners, holidays. There's quite a lot of versions of sleep, food. I don't know that I've seen coffee, but usually people would say that. My cats. Pets play an incredible role for people emotionally. So I think it's worth looking at this. And as you're looking at this, say to yourself, that is what keeps me steady and on track. How often am I actually doing it? So for those of you that said friends, when did you last ring them up? I want you to leave this webinar maybe with a little bit of a plan. So I think if you see this, so say you've written, I need a steady routine. Have you got one at the moment, or is that something you should get off this webinar and then put back in place? So I think there's a number of things to look at here. So what I've also said is, again, just some ideas for scaffolding is how you make good decisions about yourself and make good decisions perhaps about where you work or what sort of work you want to do. But even as you move throughout the day, and this is not something we can spend time on now, but I do, and I think it was reflected in that list, is sometimes just stopping to say, well, what is it that really matters to me? Now, often when I do values-based exercises with people, what we do is we think of all the things we should be. I'd want to be full of integrity, and I'd want to be honest. And, we list the things that are kind of the popular values we hear about. And that isn't because we're not those things, or I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I think are really stopping and genuinely taking time to say, what is it that matters to me? If I really had to name how I move through each day and what I try and deliver on that represents who I am and where I stand in the world, sometimes it's just very centering. I often find when I'm going through some of my toughest times at work, the thing that I come back to is, who can I be in this difficult moment? What can I at least enact that's reliable from me? And it might be, well, I'm just going to try and be kind in this situation, or I'm just going to try and be open to others' perspectives. I'll just do that. That's all I can hold on to. It can be remarkably centering. Whereas when you think, I've got a plan for this and I've got a plan for that and I've got to picture what they're going to do, and sometimes you end up not being able to carry yourself in a steady way throughout. So I think coming back to who you are in the world, what is it that drives you? And it's okay if it's just, look, I just need to earn money. That's my purpose. I just want to be a reasonable employee, not lose my job because I need money, or this job's around the corner, I've got young kids, I just want to settle. And you do a good enough job because I don't have a lot of time to do more for it. That's actually perfectly fine. In fact, it's better to own that than anything else. We're not compelled to have grand ambitions. I think getting clear what our boundaries are important, because so often we let other people define our boundaries. And, my boss just needed this by Friday, or, my mother-in-law just told me I had to do this, or, the kids' school insisted that I do whatever. Now, some of it we can't say no to, but a lot of the time we don't stop and say, what did I actually need in that situation? And we serve ourselves up to the boundaries of others, and then we resent it. And resentment takes time and robs us of energy. But if you're ever challenged by a friend, well, why did you do it? Oh, someone else told me I just had to. I think you leave yourself helpless and hopeless. Sometimes saying, well, actually, did I have choice there that I didn't take? Or if I took a step back from all these demands, is there pushback that's okay? I think also making good decisions from a relational framework. How do I take everyone into account without losing myself is important. So doing perspective taking, thinking about the effect that we have on others, how to make decisions that have a good outcome for everybody. And this is not saying agree to disagree. It's actually just not making decisions as if we're just alone. Like, well, I feel terrible, I'm sneezing everywhere, but I'm going to work because it suits me, because I feel better at work than being under the covers. That's very individual decision making. It's not relational. And you often see people enacting that at work. And I think how we get wisdom, this nebulous thing called wisdom, some of us at our best, we can be wise to a certain degree if we've looked after ourselves from that previous slide. If you have actually become steadier and you've taken time to steady yourself, you've taken a moment before a difficult meeting, you've calmed yourself a bit, you're much more likely to come into your wise mind. So again, we have more control over that than we think, but it is about getting ourselves ready to do that. And I realised myself in recent times when our work got a bit contentious that I actually got into sort of this roller coaster of rushing even more. So I'd go tearing into meetings, all of them back to back, and not necessarily coming from a wise place. I just probably looked chaotic or I was inventing on the spot. And it was amazing that just actually taking my own advice and just for making sure I had 15 minutes to calm down and think, what is the purpose of this meeting? What do I want out of it? What leadership do I want to display? I immediately was in better shape, but I just wasn't doing a healthy routine. So it is about finding that sweet spot in the middle, and but remembering that the interlocking spheres in our lives, our home front, our work front, the other demands that we have, our duty to ourselves, we can't, this picture even says there could be 3 equal sized circles, and that is not often the case. So let's have a quick look at the problem of other people, because we all know that other people get in our way and hold us up. So we're saying here, as from this study, the biggest study on human satisfaction had just published, as a very interesting book. And of course, at the heart of it, it's about good relationships. So, and you had that in your previous mentee slide. And we know, as I've mentioned, that we have all of these different spheres, and together, collectively, they help us with our equilibrium. Although it could be that for a while, work and friendship is merged, or hopefully work and your intimate life's not too merged, but you might have met your partner at work. But we try and have some different spaces in which we move, but there are times it's more than that. But it's drawing on different things to keep us steady. But it's also to bear in mind that relationships can actually cause us the greatest trouble. And usually when we're worried at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's because people are on our minds. People are bothering us. There's someone we're afraid of, someone we've got to face, someone who's getting in our way, someone who's upset us, and or a relationship that's breaking down or falling apart. So what we do is we end up giving these people a lot more time. What are they up to? What are they thinking? What are they going to say next? How do I reasonably anticipate what they're going to do? And this looms very large. What we do is often we get smaller and smaller in that conversation. It's the other troublesome person looms much larger because they potentially are going to be the ones who direct the outcome. So one thing we can do straight away is start to think about how we're going to manage ourselves. Because if we don't, these are the kind of things that happen. We can go into avoidance, not taking calls, not going to meetings, working at home more often, just feeling like we're lacking energy, getting more cranky ourselves, getting more forgetful because our minds are just captured. And we can actually underperform because we're just so caught up in this. What you'll notice if you've got a colleague on performance management, their performance tends to go downhill, even though the requirement is to step up, because stress actually gets in the way of being able to perform. So you'll remember at the beginning I said that what our workplaces want are high levels of relational skills. We may be more or less fed in our lives around our self-care and how other people are keeping us afloat. When we get very stressed, we might end up like this, which is hardly looking like we can do our best. So how to get on top of that is really critical for us to think about for a moment. And one of the things we tend to do is, and women do this more than men, we tend to then go and complain to others, which is understandable because we want to often get some validation. Look, I'm seeing this, are you seeing this, or do you think I'm reading it effectively? But often when people do that, and I'm just noting here that people are actually more likely to go to a colleague for support than they are to go to their EAP program. So again, what we do is we get stressed and we turn to people. People are our solution, but it means that whole teams can get very worried. And in fact, it can be very hard to know how to dig your way out of supporting someone effectively and not getting infected yourself by the stress. Just as an example of that, our organisation runs a course called the Accidental Counsellor, which is very much about how to be a good colleague without getting swamped, or how to be a good friend without getting swamped. I think how workplaces can support others to feel stronger is incredibly important, particularly at these very disturbing times. So I've mentioned the problem of rumination, and this is a really big topic in itself. We can get really caught on this. Sometimes rumination just leads to more rumination because you think, if I keep trying to get on top of the anxiety by overthinking it, I'll sort the problem out. And in fact, this is rarely true. Rumination can make us feel a whole lot worse. We tell ourselves we're preparing for a crisis, we're getting on top of it. But in fact, what we're often doing is digging a far deeper hole. The other thing we might do is actually just duck and run and never solve the problem ourselves. So the challenge here is actually to be helped to put some constructive steps into play. So one thing I'd recommend from this is, if you find yourself doing either one of these things, overthinking, over-talking, or trying to pretend none of it's happening, is to instead ask yourself some really simple questions like, if I really could just do one thing in my current state, what's one small thing that I could do that actually would be a start? And it might be, I just need to ring that person and book a time for coffee, or I just need to let someone know what I need them to do, or I just need to lodge that form. I need to stop worrying about the outcome. I just need to start the ball rolling. So often we can take a step that immediately lessens the burden, but we get caught in the debriefing and the excessive conversation about it, and whole work teams can get completely caught up in this behaviour, where every meeting, every coffee, every going out to lunch is going over and over the problem. And you'll remember my first slide, which is about we get very caught doing the same sorts of things. Given that we're running out of time, I'm just going to make another final couple of comments before we finish. I'd like, and I think I've set the scene for this already, really. I think this binary of work versus life is just not how things are. We have to really say, how do I want to live my life? And it may not always be in balance. And sometimes that's perfectly fine, depending if it's intentional and deliberate, or we've got caught up in someone else's story of us. So as long as you're saying, yeah, I'm putting in extra hours of work, but that's actually okay for me this year because I'm building my career, I'm going for a promotion, I've got the time to do it, I'm quite enjoying it. You don't need to feel judgment about that. It's when you've lost a grip on the intentionality or you're not attending to other goals in your life, that's where you need to be looking at it. So maybe let's think about work as playing a much bigger role in our life than and not to allow ourselves to get caught into judgment of ourselves or others about how we're doing it, but just making sure that how we're doing it, we're as in charge of as possible. So 2 final quick mentee questions that I think might be important food for thought before we finish. So the first one is, if you could judge yourself right now on a scale of 1 to 5, how good are you, do you think, at self-care? So you mentioned before the things that keep you steady. How often do you do it? We all need to go to a webinar run by this person who's outstanding. I think that's fantastic. It's fantastic to own it and to know that you've got it right for you. That's terrific. So there's some people that are doing well with it, and there are people who are hanging in with it. Absolutely. So this is really good that people are largely looking after themselves, but the ones that are rating it lower, then there's work to consider. Why is it that I'm neglecting myself? And I often talk to people about this in my work, of course. Why would you neglect yourself? It's actually a big question, and often requires a lot of thought. Secondly, then let's do this last one. Compared to how your loved ones think of you, keeping your life balance, if we're to use those terms, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you reckon you're doing what your loved ones think you should be doing in your focus? Would your loved ones say, yeah, you've got it right, I agree with how you're doing things? Or would your loved ones saying, no, you're out of whack by my judgment? Not saying you should live by what other people think of you, but let's just consider the audience of how we live. Okay, so again, good to see that some people really have got the focus of their life travelling really well, and there are some people who could do a bit more work on that. Not, as I said, because you should live according to what other people think of you, but I think other people's perspectives, if we love them and care about them, entertaining their opinion is often really important, because it's we can justify our actions to ourselves very easily, but those we want to stay close with also have good feedback. So I think also it's really important just to note that we all know through life that we can feel like we're travelling okay, and then something happens. We have a death in the family, we have a referendum, we have a world event crisis, we have a natural disaster, we have a divorce, we have a child with a chronic illness that emerges. So our steady state requires the guardrails and the good encouragement to keep us strong, because life throws us curveballs, and that's where having our self-care, our networks in place are so important, and also having good, thriving workplaces and good colleagues to keep us strong, because unfortunately life is precarious and can go up and down. To know that we've got good people at our back is critical. So we're going to wind up now. So just I won't ask you what creates the gaps, but I hope you're thinking about that. So I think I just want to say that getting really clear about your purpose, what's important to you, what drives you, and making sure that you've got a good, strong sight on yourself, not just what others tell you you need to be. How do you hold on to that? To make sure you let people in as part of your network, that it's not about retreat and withdrawal, and that you do try and calm yourself to be of a wise mind in all the spaces in which you work. And that sometimes does mean withdrawing from people to recover, so that you can step back into those relational moments, because they are often complex and they demand a lot of us. And we don't easily walk away from difficult conversations. So giving yourself time to digest, sort, reflect is a good way to stay steady as well. So I hope that this has been a valuable, provocative session for you to think about where you've been giving your time and attention, and you might go away in your work teams and consider this a little bit more, look after yourself a little bit better, and maybe have time with those that matter to you in gratitude, and offer them support and thank them for what they offer you. Thanks very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again, Elisabeth, for sharing today. It's so interesting to think people are the thing that we love and need the most in our lives. And they're also the factor in our lives that could give us the most kind of headaches and struggles as well. Such an interesting thought there. Now, just before I wrap up, I do want to note that we've shared a few links in the chat for you. One thing I do want to highlight is that we will be sending you a feedback form on after today. I would really appreciate it if you can fill that in for us. This feedback is incredibly important for us, not just so that we can continue to improve these sessions into the future, but also to help us be able to continue to offer free initiatives like this into the future. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you again, Elisabeth, and thank you, team, for your comments. Great to see you.